Hello, everyone. I am Mike Marino, Director of Customer Success at CyberMaxx Inc., a cybersecurity solutions company. Joining me today for our conversation is Connor Jackson, he's Security Research Manager here at CyberMaxx, and Jaime Beckman, Application Security Manager here at CyberMaxx. And today we're going to be talking about threat intelligence and how me as a prospective customer should be considering threat intelligence and what I should and shouldn't be care about. And also we're going to touch upon vulnerability and risk management as pertains to threats as they come in the organization. So Connor, Jaime, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure. All right. So Connor, threat intelligence seems to be the hot button topic these days. Everywhere I turn, everybody's offering some sort of threat intelligence service and some sort of feed. And it's difficult for me to determine what I should and shouldn't be caring about. So Connor, just kind of with your role within CyberMaxx and dealing with many different types of threat intelligence, what might be a good direction that you could point me in that should be something I should be putting my eyes on?
It's a good question. One of the big challenges is how do you cope with all of this data? And they call it threat intelligence, but let's be honest, it's threat data. They just vomit information at you. That's what you pay for with these feeds. But when you get it right, you start to drill down and you move away from this, just data about threats into what's becomes intelligence. It's something that might be useful to you. Maybe it's not, maybe it's useful for someone else. So you have to go through this, you then have to filter that down. And eventually, once you do enough reduction, you're going to get down to this action-based intelligence, which is something that you can actually use. And it's not an easy question to get to. It's not an easy item to tackle, regardless of how big the organization is. You still have to have all of the key points hit before you can even begin to answer that question. And like you said, a lot of people want to know about it right now.
So you mentioned something there that stuck out to me. It's like something that you can action upon. How do I go about figuring out what is actionable? Is that something specific in the kind of information that's coming in, or is it specific to my security stack and my industry?
Well, to find out what's actionable, you need a few things in place first. And I'm sure every CISO wants to know this as well, but you need to have visibility. Do you actually have visibility into what you have? Do you have EDR? Do you have network monitoring? Do you have firewalls? Do you have the basics in place? Once you've got those in place, do you have something that can, are you getting regular pen tests? Are you auditing the equipment in your environment? Do you know what version information you're on? Once you have that, do you have something in place to update these? Do you have regular patch management going on? How are you doing your updates? Are you keeping up? What's your turnaround time? Once you have that in place, then you can start to say, hey, this piece of intelligence came in. It's maybe a vulnerability or a 0-day, perhaps, against a piece of software that we use. Can you get that intelligence into the right people's hands so that they can action it, so that they can use that to direct what they do that day? And if your network is properly configured, you have a much, much bigger breathing space. If you're not, you may need to respond faster. I won't name names, but there has been certain software in the past that may have required public access to admin panels, for example. Now, if you have the software, you're still going to be vulnerable, but if your network is configured slightly differently, it's largely a non-issue for you. You have a much wider breathing room to action against this, but you still need to get that into the right set of hands to respond to it accordingly.
So it sounds like what I heard in there is there's a lot of risk management involved, not just the vulnerability management, but the risk management portion of it is having an understanding of what your environment looks like, what your tool stack is, how they all talk to one another.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the industry, isn't it? We buy and sell risk.
That actually, thank you. I appreciate the softball, Connor, because you set me up for a good question for Jaime here. So Jaime, with just not just what Connor just said in mind, but just in general, being that you help manage vulnerability and risk for our customers here at CyberMaxx, how does that come in play? Like is it something specific to a threat? Is it an exploitable threat that comes in, or is it just in general, like being a partner and looking at a customer stack in terms of trying to figure out if they are not vulnerable to a given threat?
That's a good question, and we could probably spend a lot of time talking about that, but I would say it's going to be a blend of both of those things, right? We need to understand the best we can what our customers have in their stack and how it's architected and how it's set up, and we can point out like best practices as far as, hey, you have things set up this way. We would suggest that to improve your security posture and mitigate some potential risk, that you set it up this way instead. Here's some suggestions for things you can do. And also, though, we do watch for 0 days and specific vulnerabilities as they're applicable to what our customers have in their stack. So we can provide that information to them and see if they are actually vulnerable and how much of a risk it actually is, and then we can help them get it mitigated. So it's like a combination of both of those things.
Interesting. So if I heard correctly, it sounds like there's an assessment part that comes into it, where number one, you make a determination whether or not customer is vulnerable. If they're not vulnerable, do you give them the evidence that helps prove out why they're not vulnerable?
Yeah, we depending on how we're interacting with that customer, we can provide them with that evidence post assessment, or we can say you have things set up properly, that this is a non-issue for you. If you are interested, you can still take these steps to patch or run this script or whatever, depending on what the vulnerability is. The biggest part, I think the most important part, is to like Connor mentioned, they have to have things set up properly. That's like the best line of defense right there. You want to be proactive when you're talking about technology security, and less reactive. There's always going to be some reactiveness, just because things change so quickly. There's always new things popping up, right? But you want to be proactive and have things architected the best you possibly can, and that's going to give you the best security posture.
And what Jamie touched on there, it was in reverse, but essentially it's a life cycle, isn't it? You have to identify what threats you're looking at first. You have to process them. You need to disseminate them out to the right team. You need to come up with actionable items to come from this, some feedback, some mitigation strategies, and then that feeds back into itself, so you can improve the life cycle for the following time.
So I want to backtrack for a moment here to threat intelligence again. So we talked about actionable threat intelligence, but what about that non-actionable threat intelligence, or the noise? Like, is there an easy way to identify the bits that I shouldn't care about?
So that's the $1 million question. If anyone could answer that, you could stop the entire industry. Probably from a high level, the best thing to start with is to break down the data you have into different areas. So a really popular convention to use is tactical, operational, and strategic. And these all apply to different levels. So if you're a CISO, you want to know strategic level intelligence. Like, what things can you do to give you, high level trends, motives, that kind of thing. If you're boots on the ground, maybe you work in a SOC, maybe you do what Jamie and I do, maybe you do something, something else, but you're hands-on. You're going to want to know about tactical intelligence. You want, real atomic information that you can use. And then if you're maybe a slightly higher levels stakeholder, you're going to want to know more in line with operational items. So, things like infrastructure, TTPs, what categories are these in? Then you can start to map them to MITRE. and feed this back up the chain to say, hey, we need to reorganize our architecture because, you know, this new breed of threats, which doesn't happen often, but this new breed has come out, and it's something that we're likely going to be facing again in the future. If you cast your mind back to Felina, the 0-day vulnerability in Office, just for anyone who's unfamiliar with it, essentially what it did was it used the diagnostic troubleshooter to execute its payload. Right? If you had a properly architected network and your environment was set up correctly, yes, an attacker could still exploit it, but that exploit would be contained and you likely wouldn't be able to reach out. If your network was not correctly set up, the attacker could still exploit it, but the offset, so the follow-on action from that could be significantly more damaging to your network. So it really ties back to what Jaime was saying about going through these mitigation strategies and correctly architecting the network to go for this lower or even zero risk model.
So do my threat intelligence sources matter? Like, are there good, do you have any sources that you would recommend that I, as let's just say a CISO for a medical company, that I should pay for, that I should buy?
Yeah, so that's a yes and no question. A lot of intelligence is regurgitated information. I'm going to see something, I'm going to put it out there. Then Mike, you're going to read that and you're going to put it out there to your network, and Jaime will do the same, and then Jaime will say something and I'll put that out to mine. So you often don't see it firsthand. It's usually second, third, fourth hand.
Mm-hmm.
So the sources, in my experience, don't matter as much as one might think. What's far more important is how fast you can respond once you have that information. So you can put a ton of time and money and effort into getting more data, getting more sources, but you might be better putting that into building out an internal structure and a life cycle so that you can respond to this information faster.
Interesting. How about for you, Jaime? Like, as it pertains specifically to vulnerability and risk management suites, how do you approach that intelligence in terms of what does and doesn't matter?
Well, it kind of depends on, who you're watching it for, like which customer, because they're all unique. But my team does keep an eye on, CVE, CVSS information to see if there are any high risk applicable vulnerabilities coming down the pike. I don't know that there's any like specific feeds or tools that we use. It's just, CVE has the MITRE framework, and those are, they publish all of the vulnerabilities and they have a great deal of information about them, keeping an eye on those. Some of the members of my team get alerts when new ones come out and just go take an eyeball at them to see if they're applicable for us or any of our clientele.
I imagine that could also lead to a lot of noise in scanning results as well when you do a vulnerability scan. How do you parse through all that?
It kind of depends on the tool. Each tool has some kind of risk, like scoring system when you're talking about vulnerability management. And you really have to rely on that being configured properly, that it's a reputable tool, and then it's going to give you good information as to what are the things that you should pay attention to. If it's really high risk, if it's putting your customer in a lot of risk, then we're going to bring attention to it. Like Connor's mentioned a couple times, it really also, sometimes there's going to be a risk that is going to show up in those tools that is going to be a low risk or a zero risk, because you have other tools in your stack that are going to protect you against that. So there's so many layers of security, in modern information technology security. You have to, because there's so many vectors in. You really want to be mindful of how things are set up, and like Connor also mentioned, the lifecycle management of your tools and your network. But we do watch the ones that are high risk per tool, provide feedback to our customers on, hey, these are some things we really think you should address. At least take a look at and know these are here. You have these assets using these older software versions, for example, or there's something going on with your patch management lifecycle. It's behind. Just helping point out those things, because all of those things play into reducing risk. Things being patched, lifecycle, getting into newer versions of the software, just improving the overall security of your company. So, to your original question, how do you kind of parse through the noise? It's tricky, but to some degree, you have to be really familiar with the industry and what's going on, and you rely somewhat on the information that's provided to you by the tool that your customer is using.
So Jamie, you touched on something there. And I'd like to get both of your thoughts on this. Jamie, I'll start with you. So you mentioned the security layers that you have in place to help act as these barriers, as there might be an exposed vulnerability from the standpoint of this tool that you use as a vulnerability, but I've got other tools in my stack that protect me. Is there a certain pattern in place where layers act as individual barriers, where I have to go through barrier 1, then barrier 2, then barrier 3 in order to have an impact, versus they link together like basically like links in an actual chain, and if I break one, they all fall down? Are there situations where one arises versus the other, and things that I potentially look out for to avoid the breaking of the chain situation?
I think that the chain breaking situation is going to be a really high risk, nasty vulnerability, because if they get ingress at this point in your network, in your security stack, and it knocks down all of the other walls, all of your other tools, I don't know what kind of vulnerability that would be, but it would be extremely nasty, right? And that would, in my mind, that would be something that needs to be addressed immediately. If
Let's
it
say it's
can,
like a pre-auth RCE into like a cloud panel. Use
yeah,
that as like, if you want to use that as an example, what would the knock-on effect be?
So pre-auth RCE into a cloud panel, because I pretend to be smarter than I actually am when it comes to security. What do you mean by that, Connor?
Authenticated, and RCE is remote code execution. So an attacker can run code into your network when they are not authenticated. It's basically anyone on the internet. Cloud panel is like the control panel for your cloud infrastructure. So they can potentially have access to your control panel for all of your cloud. That would be an example of something that can break a stack, but it's very infrequent that comes up. Jamie, have you seen anything like that?
I've heard of things like that happening, but I've never, fortunately, I've never been working with or supporting a customer that had anything like that in my personal experience at CyberMaxx. Something like that would be a big deal, right? And it boils down to, how in the heck are they going to get pre-auth access to your cloud environment? How is that thing set up that they can get that kind of access?
It's public facing Citrix server.
Right. Like it's just not best practice, right? You don't have anything in front of it protecting you. So I think it would be like a perfect storm to have that kind of vulnerability. It would be some kind of nasty exploit, and it would have to rely on the environment being set up in just a certain way and using certain types of tools. And it would require immediate, like you're going to have to take things off the network and, basically re-architect how things are set up, patch, any number of things to fix that. Whereas most vulnerabilities are going to be caught by other places in your network, right? How many layers of stuff do most modern businesses have, right? They have a firewall, maybe they have IPS, they've got EDR, WAF, vulnerability management. I mean, there's tools that you can have in place that are going to help catch things before it gets to a level like that. Connor, maybe you have experienced, working on your side of the house, customers who have had something like that.
Yeah, I've worked directly on the FIR instance where an attacker got into cloud panels and done exactly that. Sometimes it was because of poorly architected environments. Other times it was just, getting a user to click a link, running
Right.
an info stealer and taking credentials, things that you can't protect against with patching and software, essentially.
Social engineering.
Yeah, you really have to have a properly, that's all policy. That's the only way to protect against it.
Policy and training.
Exactly. You could have a 600 character long password, but someone gets access to it. It doesn't matter
right.
what it is, how good your password policy is.
Or if they open that email and click the link.
Yeah, as soon as that link is clicked, something's going to happen. But it keeps us in a job, so silver linings, right?
You get a 600 long character password. I'm hoping the attacker falls asleep before they finish entering it.
It's actually just the first chapter of Pretty Women. Going back to your point a second ago, you said about vulnerability chains. It's actually to me, it's an interesting conversation around that because obviously there's bug bounties. Big software companies want to know about these things before the attackers do. They want to make sure their products are patched. It's a PR nightmare if there's a fallout from something like this. So what we see is bug bounties come up. People find vulnerabilities, they go to software providers and they get paid for them. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 3-4 years, maybe longer, they're less conducive to basically paying out for these things. We often hear results back like, "Oh, this isn't vulnerable. This isn't that critical. It's only this. It's only that." So people start to. It's almost like they become desensitized to it. Because once you've heard of the 500th critical vulnerability, if everything's critical, nothing is.
Yeah.
So what we've started to see is a lot of researchers, instead of finding a vulnerability and reporting it, they're holding it back. And that's not from a place of malice. That's from a place of they're trying to find a chain where they can link 2, 3, 4 vulnerabilities together and then go to the providers and say, hey, here's a chain of 4 vulnerabilities that can be absolutely disastrous for someone. And that seems to be the standard now that's required to get noticed. That and a fancy logo. You have one of those two things, you seem to get a lot more publicity than just reporting it the old-fashioned way.
Which is a little unfortunate, really.
Yeah, it is.
Because somebody who's got 1 or 2 of those bugs or vulnerabilities in place, they're not going to get the attention until you have a group of them, right?
Exactly. You need to be able to climb these things in stages. And security products are getting better. People are becoming more informed. Networks are getting, better designed. So you need more and more vulnerabilities together for this to be even a conversation to have. And that comes, if you tie that back to threat intelligence, that's a real big issue for a CISO is how do you track all these different floating point operations that are going on where you have vulnerability A connects to B and E. If you don't know about B, how do you know, A and E are going to be applicable to you? And that's only 3. Imagine you've got, 500 of these a day being thrown at you.
Fairly terrifying thought. Thank you for that.
Sorry about that.
No,
Yeah, that's what comes back to, can you get this information to the right team? Can you disseminate it correctly? And then just having that visibility. Are you aware of all of this? Because there's two types, right? There's the vulnerabilities you know about and the ones you don't. And that's where your effort goes, is trying to find as many as you can. But you gotta dig for them, because it's just buried. And every single network is unique.
interesting. It also sounds like the software provider's response to threat identification plays a big part in this. Like to your point, bug bounty comes up, you know, sounds like there has been what's the term that I'm looking for? A reluctance to recognize serious threats being brought to their attention. You know, that's a different problem altogether. One that sounds like we all have to deal with, but I don't know how you go about solving that.
Yeah, there's a lot of big name providers will often respond with, that's by design, or that's a non-issue type response. To the point that it's kind of funny at times, in a really morbid sort of way. I'm sure you see this as well, Jamie, on the management side.
Absolutely. And it's haha, not really funny. They'll tell you that that's part of that current release, but then interestingly, that very same thing will be patched in their next minor release, right? So it's like a constant game of watching that stuff and bring it to their attention and trying to help your customers to keep their head above the water.
You nearly want to reply to their email with, "Thanks, your humor humors me,"
Right?
and just move on with your day, right?
Yes, absolutely.
In terms of that idea of sources of threat intelligence, does my industry matter as it pertains to threat intelligence? Like if I'm in the medical industry or the defense industry or whatever the case may be, are there certain threat feeds that I should or should not be looking at?
I'm sure Jamie has some points to add to this as well. The point that I'd like to make is, it's not as much as people think it does. What we've seen in more recent years is attackers go after technologies more so than industries. It's not to say that they don't go after industry; they still do. But what we're seeing is they tend to go after technologies, because if they can exploit one piece of software and you can scan the entire internet in 24 hours, why make more work for yourself? You can just go after everyone who's running that specific thing.
Yeah, I
Gotcha.
agree. Absolutely.
So it's more about a threat actor being opportunistic than it is about them having a specific agenda per se.
Well, I mean, there's some threat actors that have a specific agenda. They're targeting a specific vertical. There's always that, but it's moved more towards what are people using in their network? How is their network architected? What security do they have in place? Threat actors are constantly scanning to find weaknesses, and that is regardless of what industry it's part of. Now, specific industries have differing like levels of audit and compliance requirements, from that side of the coin, right? Banking, healthcare, there's all kinds of different audit and compliance standards they have to uphold and meet that are going to affect IT security. But from the attacker side, it's very opportunistic.
Thank you, Jamie. Well, actually, I want to thank both of you. Appreciate the insight and the conversation. I learned a lot from it. Hopefully, other people who are listening learned something from it as well. And I look forward to our next conversation. And if I may, shameless plug us at CyberMaxx here. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any security needs that you need filling. Our number is 877-247-4379. Again, CyberMaxx, that's 877-247-4379. 4379. So again, Mike Marino here at CyberMaxx, and I want to thank Connor Jackson and Jaime Beckman for their time today.
Thanks,
Thank
Jamie.
you. Have a great day.
You too.